Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 1 p.m. Eastern Time, anyway, CME Palooza session. This is our dessert session that we're having since it's after our lunch session. We made this our dessert session. I have my cup of coffee. I'm all ready to go. Sponsored by Prova Education. This is our Chatting with Graham McMahon session. I probably don't need to really give much of an introduction to either of these two gentlemen, but just so you're all aware, our moderator or interviewer today is Lawrence Sherman, Senior Vice President of Educational Strategy at Topec Global. And of course, our special guest is Dr. Graham McMahon, President and CEO of the ACCME. Very quickly, just some housekeeping slides to go through. As always, we want to give a big thank you to all of our sponsors. We have our gold sponsors, Genentech, Prova Education, our silver sponsors, ASIM, Forefront Collaborative, Global Academy for Medical Education, Integrity Continuing Education, and PCE. And our bronze sponsors. Lawrence, we moved on to 2 slides this year for our sponsors, so it's bigger, and I can actually read it without having to lean in and squint. It's nice. ACHL, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Global Education Group, Helio Education Lab, Highmark CE, Impact Education, Infograph Ed, Connective, PCN, PVI, RMEI, and Thistle Editorial. As always, we have 3 ways that you can send in questions. You can use our CME Palooza text line, 267-6660-CME, 0263. You can also click on the Google Slides link. I am Derek, so you want to click on the link beside my name. It's right above the video feed that you're watching on the live page. Or you can also tweet your question in using the CME Palooza hashtag. I'll be monitoring all of these different channels for your questions, and then I'll be sending them on to Lawrence, who has his phone. So if you see Lawrence checking his phone during the session, he's not monitoring for some important email. He's looking for questions, I think, anyway. That's supposed to work. And our speaker disclosure slide, probably don't even need to present this, but just opinions are our own, not a reflection of our employer. And that is it. So with that, Lawrence and Dr. McMahon, I am going to turn it over to you to take away.
Thank you, Derek. And thank you for hosting us in the hallowed halls of the ACCME. That's right. Where every room is named after a different criteria. It's so not true. I had to disclose that. So these are actually very beautiful offices. Thanks for letting us do this.
Oh, pleasure.
So when we first came up with this idea and we reached out to you, what was your hope that we would get out of this session and actually agreed to sit through this?
I mean, obviously, we're an accreditor. We have standards to deploy to the community to ensure that education is high quality. But we're increasingly moving not just to be a cop, but as you've heard me say before, a coach, and support the community and listen to them, understand them, and evolve the system for them. So for everyone watching, I'm really hoping that you're hearing from us that we're here to help, we're here to support you, and the things that we're doing are designed to try and make your life easier and allow you to do terrific educational work.
Well, you know, I sit here not only as an interviewer, but as a provider. So yeah. I can certainly speak to the fact that the evolution of the ACCME from my personal experience has been one of, you know, night and day. And it feels like a different place. And when I hear you speak at all the conferences, I watch the questions, I listen to the questions, and it seems that you really have a passion to make sure that the providers get what they need.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an educator too. I'm an endocrinologist, but I've spent, you know, the last 20 years of my life teaching other professionals, teaching students, teaching residents, and I think I get it. I mean, I want the educators out there to have the tools, the resources, the flexibility and permission they need to go out there and do awesome learning, because the system needs you in spades. And one of my priorities is the growth of the CME community so that they can do more, be resourced more, get more support from institutions and other places, and do great work, because without it, stagnancy in healthcare is be guaranteed.
Thank you, by the way, to everybody that sent in questions. We're going to try to get to all of them, plus we're going to try to answer any that come up online. But as we were talking earlier, as we were setting this up, we looked at some of these questions, and I wondered, and I said to Graham, I wonder how many people actually have reached out to the ACCME and utilized the info at email address or just called. I know that through the years I've called when a question has come up. And are you seeing increasing calls or touches from the providers? Do you hope to see more?
Well, I think one of the things I talk about when I'm out there with the community is if you're tempted to say no to something that feels like a good educational idea, and you're tempted to say no because you believe ACCME would have a problem with it, then check with us first, because we'll try and find a way to help you say yes. Because if it's educationally robust and commercially independent and assessed appropriately and those things, we want you to go and do it. And we want to find a way that you're not constrained. So use info@accme.org as our email, call us. We're happy to talk to you. The other thing I was saying to Lawrence is some people think as an accreditor, if you that there's worry that if you air your dirty laundry to us, this happened in our educational event, we're embarrassed about it, but we're trying to find a way forward to resolve it. Can you give us some advice? We want to be part of the solution with you, and we don't want to be, we would be kind and supportive for problems that you're seeing in your practices and your programs. Not, we wouldn't come after you with a hammer.
So sort of not a why did you call, but why didn't you call philosophy.
And we're here to help. I mean, we really are. I mean, I think people have to hear that yes, we have standards, and we uphold those standards and inspect those standards, but that's those standards are minimum thresholds that are relevant for a small number of providers out there. Our commendation criteria and our other approaches are designed for everyone who's moving the industry forward to try and do great education.
Well, I like that. The first question I want to ask that was submitted, and thank you for those of you that were brave enough to include your name because we will refer to it, is from Audrey Turnow from Paradigm. And it was, you referenced before, you're a provider, you're a learner, you're a practitioner. What's your preferred method for learning?
Well, it's changed. I mean, I think now I would say that I don't particularly like more passive forms of education. I don't think it'll surprise you to hear that. For all the work we're doing to try and get the provider community to put on active learning programs that engage clinicians and make them deliberate, those are the same types of programs that I learned from. I'm an endocrinologist, and some of the learning experiences that I've had that have been most substantial and meaningful for me are literally small group conversations with other specialists in my area where we share feedback and wisdom about approaches to individual contexts and scenarios that change the way I might think about a particular problem and help me problem solve. So I think using education for its convening function, bringing people together for that form, really is a way that I like to learn from and with my colleagues. I would also say that I expect and increasingly look for the opportunity to work hard in an educational activity. That's a little different from some of the tradition around CME, which is often presented as, let's make this as easy as possible because we want to create engagement. The challenge is that the easier you make it and the less cognitive work, the less effective the actual education can be. The more you strain people's brains, the more you engage them, the more you strain my brain in an educational program, the more likely it is I'll get something out of it. So for it to be a meaningful educational experience, it should be hard work.
And so I guess that translates to the way the criteria are evolving as well, and the commendation criteria. A lot of questions came in around the new criteria. Well, the newish, the new way to look at it. Sure. Right? So, it's funny, way back when the new criteria came in, a lot of providers said, boy, this is just helping us to justify and to reinforce that we're doing it the right way. Is that the view of the new-ish criteria for commendation?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, you can see in this, this is an educator's wheel. I mean, anyone who's seen our accommodation criteria in the wheel will see approaches to education that are instantly recognizable as meaningful and important and valuable. And that's exactly how we've constructed this. We want it to be a way to promote best practices in education, while at the same time giving providers of all different types flexibility in the way in which they evolve their own programs. I think the fundamental message that I'm trying to communicate to providers is develop an educational plan for your group. You know, be intentional about how you're going to evolve your program to adapt better practices in education that are going to make for higher quality learning experiences that are more effective and efficient. And the encouragement from the commendation is a recognition for the work that many of the activities that providers are already doing, but it's also an incentive for providers who aren't doing some of the things on the wheel to see opportunities for progressive development for themselves.
Well, it's interesting. One of the questions was around, do you think that framing the criteria for accreditation with commendation this way will actually result in fewer providers achieving that status or more, or is it an opportunity for you to help more to achieve that status?
Yeah, I don't know is the answer to the question as to how many. We've had our first applicants on our most recent accreditation review committee to use the new criteria as their approach to apply for accommodation. And it's terrific to be able to see the exemplars that are being presented in these applications that reflect best practices in education. You also remember that when we constructed these accommodation criteria, we asked the provider community, where should the threshold be? Because we don't really know where should it be. And the community gave us pretty consistent answers, and for some of these where there are thresholds, you know, it resulted in a 10% threshold for things like communications and skills development, and that was down from 25%. Importantly, we set these thresholds and designed these to be accessible to every type of provider, whether you're a MAC or a society or a medical school or a hospital. You should see things in here that are easy. And the other thing that's worth noting is that there's some gimmies in here. You know, do something new for your program. I mean, come on. I mean, it's a really broad opportunity to engage with this process and move along and innovate and evolve. So I don't know where it's going to go in terms of how many providers will get commendation. I prefer if it was 100%, but it won't be 100% almost certainly. But the goal is not to create an obstacle to get providers to commendation. The goal is to provide a roadmap that encourages and rewards them for going there.
And here's a formative assessment. There's at least one person, possibly two, watching, because Derek has texted me 2 questions. I don't know if they're 2 from the same person or 2 from 2 individuals, but we have at least 2 people watching.
Yay.
So we're not just talking to Derek.
It's 100 people who've all sent the same question. How's that?
Excellent. Thank you. So just to finish up about these commendation criteria, what resources are available and what new resources might be available for providers to learn more and to understand better?
Yeah, there's 3 resources I would point people to most specifically. Interestingly, for accreditors, we just launched our first online course in how to make accreditation decisions using the criteria. That's not relevant for the majority of people, but it demonstrates to you that we've stood up our own online education portal, that this is the only course on it right now. It's not publicly accessible, but we would anticipate in that online portal having an increasing array of educational materials for providers and others. The second thing is that our website has, for each of the criteria, including each of the accommodation criteria, a specific web page that has the criteria, the thresholds, the definitions, but also a whole series of examples of things that would meet this criteria that have been largely developed from examples we've seen in self-study reports and presented at our meetings. And the third thing I wanted to draw people's attention to is, of course, our live meetings. Our staff are around at a variety of regional and local meetings. Mid-Atlantic CME meetings this week, and we obviously also have our annual meeting next April. I encourage you to go to ACCME 2018 and sign up for at least getting the information about the meeting. Have a look at some of our preliminary plans for that meeting, but it's going to be terrific. So those three places are increasingly our learning management system as we evolve that, our website, of course, which has videos and lots of text and information and examples, and then our meetings where we talk about these in some depth.
I will say I heard from the provider community that your last meeting was, they said, the best that they'd ever attended. So the feedback is good. Last question about the criteria. Why did you decide on 7+1 to get a commendation rather than just any 8?
Because originally, in fact, we had just 8. But we had a strong series of inputs from several in our stakeholder community, including the provider groups, that said we want to be able to demonstrate outcomes. And if the accredited CME community is going to have legitimacy, it's going to have to demonstrate higher level outcomes. So you've got to hold us to account for that. And if you do that, you'll essentially convene us to a mechanism of sharing that drives us all forward. So the most basic outcome criteria is actually very straightforward to attain from our perspective, from everything we know. But the fundamental idea is that we should be accountable if you're going to get a long term and be demonstrated as a commendable provider, to have some data about the efficacy and of your CME program.
And that leads to nice aggregate data for you, I suppose, as you look at it.
Yeah, we're interested in the data because it creates a resource to share. We'd love for our website to have many more examples of things that are going really well in CME programs nationally, so that we can all learn from it. Our meetings are often about convening and talking about those best examples and the experience CME providers have in putting on great programming. But the outcomes criteria specifically allows us to start accumulating more information to demonstrate to others that might be skeptical about CME's efficacy and efficiency, so that we can say, hold on a second, before you throw us under the bus, have a look at what our CME community can do.
A question came in just now in follow-up to that says, currently a provider that receives a progress report is disqualified from commendation. When so much work goes and educational intervention goes into these criteria, why can't commendation be granted when the progress report is satisfactorily resolved by the state accreditor?
Well, it depends on the nature of the problem. If problems are substantial enough for us to require progress reporting, or indeed a monitoring progress report, which is ongoing supervision of a CME provider, then those are not providers that are demonstrating an ability to meet the highest level of expectations for the accreditation community, at least not right now. There's also got to be a disincentive for organizations to stretch their compliance with our primary model and our primary commitment to the community, so that we've got to be attentive to disclosures and conflict resolution and these other issues that frequently get providers into trouble. The one that we've most seen somewhat recently is using employees of commercial interests in CME programs. If you do that, you're going to get yourself into trouble, and we see it, and that is not commendable behavior.
See, I think that's one of those sources of debate that we hear out there, because we know that there are those occasions when it's permitted, but it's a limited window of where it's permitted.
Yeah, very limited window. It's essentially, you're talking about basic science, and you're not talking about anything that's relevant right now to clinical care, period. You're not talking about things that could be used on patients. You're essentially talking about fundamental science. And the second is you're doing a demonstration of a technology that's produced by a company, where the only people or the best people to do a demonstration of technology are company representatives. But in that context, the company representative is not allowed to make recommendations about whether the device should be used or whether it should be used in preference to another competitor, but just how it will be used if you choose to select it.
Well, moving away from that.
Sure.
Karen Roy had sent in a question. Are you working with leaders in Europe and the rest of the world to help them guide the development of regional standards and guidelines and make mutual recognition for CE programs easier? And a text question came in that said, has there even been much interest in organizations applying directly to ACCME from outside the US?
So we're pretty engaged in the international community conversations, and in some respects, several countries around the world look to the US model as they try and build out their programs for themselves. So we, as essentially a voluntary or charitable gesture, we provide advice to CPD accreditors or CPD organizations internationally. They're just trying to build out their programs and start to do good work. What we've given specific and formal advice to literally scores of countries over even the last 2 years alone. It's interesting that the last week or 2 weeks ago, I was in London for the International Association of Medical Regulatory Authorities meeting.
Sorry, I missed it.
But it was actually a terrific meeting because it was focused on how licensing authorities and other regulators use CPD to make quality determinations about their licensees. And there's essentially a great deal of interest internationally about using education and forming curricula for professionals in practice that allow them to continue to maintain and improve their practice performance. I would say that we have substantial recognition with a range of substantial equivalency recognition with a range of other systems around the world, and we continue to look at and evaluate applications from other recognition applications. My sense is that the world is increasingly moving to a consensus around what counts in medical education and CME. And in 10 or 15 years' time, I can imagine a more consistent model across countries, in many countries internationally.
Well, let's take an easier one.
Okay, I'm dreading this one now.
Oh, because it's my definition.
Yeah.
So Alexander Housen from Thistle Editorial LLC said, when people say that CME is thinly disguised promotional education, or that there's little evidence that CME actually changes behavior, what are your forum responses? And then she said, well, that's 2 questions. But I think they lump together nicely.
Well, if you're making a claim that CME has been corrupted by commercial influences, I'd say, show me the evidence, because we've looked and we continue to look, and we extremely rarely find it. And our rules are working, and I think the fact that the standards for commercial support have been adopted by many of our colleagues across the professions in nursing and pharmacy and optometry and all of these other disciplines tells you that it's a reasonable compromise model in the ways in which we manage commercial support and maintain the independence of CME. And I'm just not seeing evidence that CME in the US model is commercially manipulated. Does that stop some commercial organizations of calling promotional activities CME? It doesn't, because they do, and it's not accredited CME, and that's a problem. But I am hoping that increasingly things like using our logo, using the phrase accredited CME, will permeate out to the physician community, and they'll increasingly recognize the difference between promotion and marketing and accredited learning. The second part of that question was, how do I argue with people who say CME is ineffective? I think the first thing I say is, well, do you send your kid to kindergarten? Or do you believe that people can learn? And of course, people can learn. We've known that for millennia. And people do learn. It's a much more interesting question to say, what's the best way to promote learning than to say, can people learn? Because of course education is effective, and of course learning is effective. Are there better ways to learn more efficiently and effectively? Sure, and that's the subject of rigorous conversation and debate and research. But an idea that CME could be in any way ineffective is ridiculous.
Well, sort of dovetailing on that, we have a text question that says, given what we know about behavior change science, might we move credit or some form of credit from being education-based to being behavior-based? So instead of the left side, the right side.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a diabetologist, and if you're a diabetologist, you're essentially a behaviorist, because so little of what I do in my clinical practice is about prescribing the right medicine. So much of it is about helping the patient take the medicine and do the other things in life that makes a difference to their well-being. So I think a lot about behavior, and a lot of my own educational research has been about behavioral modification in teams and in the performance of clinical work. So I think about this a lot. However, there is a value in learning as well. Behavioral change can be hard to demonstrate. So for example, if you value the ability to solve complex problems in medicine, the way to evaluate or test that is to present the clinician with complex problems and show that they can solve those. And there's extreme value in developing systems that support complex problem solving for clinicians. Is there value in casual conversations where clinicians share information with each other to help them make better decisions? That's also very valuable, and there isn't an iota of behavioral change necessarily demonstrated through those types of interactions. Is there value in driving towards behavioral change as an outcome in education? Of course, in the right circumstance, it makes the most sense in the world, particularly when it's a demonstrable or psychomotor skill. And ultimately, does it matter that whether or not education drives patient outcomes? Of course it does. That's extremely important. It would be clumsy of us, though, to devalue learning as a primary outcome of CME in favor of behaviorism, because both are valuable and they're not necessarily universally the right outcome for an individual learning activity.
It seems that there's sort of stacking, right, and scaffolding when you think about it, because you can't jump to behavior change until you've had the baseline knowledge.
Yeah, it's why we've been encouraging the boards, for example, around the MOC work to combine MOC2 and MOC4 into an integrated approach to behavioral change. And it's not just about, can you audit your practice and demonstrate a change in patient outcomes or performance of process measures, but are you actually educating clinicians about how to do that and what they need to do? And merging the two is much more effective. And the same approach is true for education. You're much better off taking a longitudinal approach to an outcome, being intentional about what that outcome is, and then delivering a sequence of educational interventions that support the clinician in making those changes, or at least reflecting on their own behaviors in the clinical environment, whatever those may be.
Well, remember your criteria, it says try something new?
Yeah.
Well, if they just replay that recording of you saying all that, if each provider just did that, they hit that criteria.
Oh, for sure. They'll hit multiple criteria with one activity.
You just got a free answer from Graham McMahon.
But it is interesting, though, that we have been guilty traditionally in CME of the one and done mentality. You know, we put on a terrific educational program, we're proud of it, we do our assessment of it, and we close the books, and it's done. When all of us watching this and us two talking here know that that's not particularly effective as an approach to engage clinicians in self-reflection and behavior modification that endures. So a lot of the criteria are essentially moving providers to thinking of their educational experiences as in the longitudinal approach, that it's got to be repeated, it's got to be reinforced. It's got to be consolidated, and you've got to find ways to re-engage clinicians over the longer term. And that's where the whole premise of creating an educational home comes from, is that if you're really going to deliver quality in education, a lot of it is about relationships. And relationships require an environment and a community in which you can develop and see your professional growth in front of your eyes.
That sort of speaks to the interprofessional education as well, because if you're creating this educational home, this community of learners and clinicians, it's not just medicine.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, well, today in our offices, Lawrence saw several familiar faces because our joint accreditation surveys are happening right now. We're actively involved in collaborations with our colleagues in nursing and pharmacy and joint accreditation, where we essentially agree on shared standards for one accreditation model that allows providers to issue multiple types of credits, nursing, pharmacy, and medicine, with more coming soon. And that joint accreditation model reflects our instincts around interprofessionalism, and again, reinforcing this idea, excuse me, as a diabetologist, just think about how little I could do in my practice if it was just me seeing patients and prescribing pills. The needs of patients, you need a team. That's increasingly true whether you're in an OR, in an ER, or in an ambulatory care environment. You need a team working with you and building off of each other's reflective skills. And it's demonstrated repeatedly now, the more we learn together, the better we practice together. And CME environments and CPD environments that engage the team, that are planned for and by the team, that isn't just co-location of professions in a room, but it's designed to develop team skills and team performance, and where you acculturate physicians to be ready to learn from nurses and vice versa across the team. Those are really important transitions for educators.
Well, it seems to me that certainly in the CME, CPD space, that's where it really needs to be. It needs to start earlier. But if it hasn't, it's those people who are already practicing together need to be able to learn together, because if we teach them disparately and then say, okay, now go play nicely together, it's a lot harder.
Well, that's why we have such good and important relationships with our colleagues at LCME and ACGME and ACOM and the other regulators, because we talk about the need to support professionalism. And if we're not doing this together, then we might as well not do it, because the continuum is extremely important in acculturating a transformation in the way in which we develop medical professionals. That's especially true in the GME environment, where clinicians are, junior clinicians are starting to see how people really behave. And the case examples that we're starting to accumulate that have been summarized in our reports around joint accreditation now, about what happens when you change the culture in an organization to be more interprofessional, and you don't necessarily have a nursing conference room and a pharmacist's lounge. You essentially have a team environment. The changes that occur in both quality delivery, but also in mutual care of team members become quite powerful.
Let's go back to one of the questions that was sent in earlier.
Sure.
They should be rewarded for participating
Absolutely.
early. We would like to be able to, this is like a case study question.
Okay.
We would like to be able to offer CME credit to physicians for their learning from planning and presenting a CME session, only to peers, not credit for teaching medical students or residents. All the examples we have found from other CME programs are very involved applications, including descriptions of their personal learning gap and a summary and evaluation of what they learned. However, AMA simply requires a copy of the advertising flyer or other documentation that they presented. Which is correct for us in order to provide this much requested CME credit to our speakers? And that's Deb from Hartford Healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I would focus on the learning that you're creating for that individual clinician. I mean, if you register one activity for your program for the year that says, learning from teaching or something like that, and as your clinician community is engaged in telling you what they're planning to do and what they plan to learn from the experience, and you reach out to them afterwards and say, what did you learn from this experience? That's credit-worthy right there. I mean, there's a lot of lore in what is appropriate and what is acceptable in CME, and I would direct all of you watching to the simplification and alignment materials that we posted on our website about AMA and ACCME's agreement. Essentially, now the approach is, if there is quality learning happening, CME is there. If you're not there and you think that there's a reason why that we've placed that means that you can't be there, then you should be in touch with us, because that's likely to be a misperception.
So a lot of this lore is about required documentation and where it came from.
Yeah, I mean, that ACCME is evolving, and our surveyors are evolving, and many of the community out there wonders whether they can trust what I'm saying, in that, are they going to be held to account for layers and reams of documentation that are different from what this simplicity of what I'm describing to them are. And all I can say is, my encouragement is to you is to read our documentation, read the case examples, talk to us if you have questions, but go do great education, and we'll try and be with you and minimize your perceptions about bureaucratic burden. Remember that our sample activity development form is like at most, I think, a page and a half. Many of you out there have activity approval forms that are more than 2, 3, 4, even 5, 6, 7 pages long. I mean, what, are you crazy? I mean, who's going to fill out that stuff? I mean, you want to be able to plan activities for this afternoon, this morning. And this idea that you need signatures or you need complex disclosures for activities that are very low risk, where there are almost no likelihood of a relevant disclosure, get out of your own way. I mean, you're create a whole lot of barriers for your own program by perceptions about what the requirements are.
Yeah, as a surveyor, let me say thank you, because those forms that are filled out are in every one of the files and the documentation that has to be gone through. So you just said what we can't on site. So thank you.
Yeah, the other thing I just remind you is that many of the more sophisticated providers out there aren't putting forms like that in front of their clinicians. They're saying, call us or email us what you're trying to do, and a CME provider fills out the form based on what they think the needs are likely to be, or what the program elements might be, and also remember that you should focus on relevant disclosures. A lot of CME providers I see out there get all disclosures, maybe because they think they have to get them for their own institutional requirements, but we only require relevant disclosures, and you reduce a ton of your work by focusing only on relevant conflicts of interest disclosures. And remember that we don't hold a CME provider to account if their professional community isn't honest. It's their responsibility, as long as they use the right definition and gets relevant disclosures, to manage their process efficiently.
Okay, we have another early question.
Sure.
Give me a minute because I'm going to read it. It's from Michelle Hunicke from ACR. Okay. Ready?
Yeah.
We have 22 minutes. I should get through this question in 21.
Okay.
Giving you 1 minute to answer. Starts out very simply. What is considered commercial bias? But I go on. Any reference to a product or vendor name is verboten when applying for CME approval at our institution, but from the standards I've seen, such as 5.2, presentations must give a balanced view of therapeutic options. Use of generic names will contribute to this impartiality. If the CME educational material or content includes trade names, where available trade names from several companies should be used, not just trade names from a single company. Back to the question. It appears that this is allowed. It was a recent problem where a question was declined because it listed several vendors in the choices. So I guess in evaluation. Technology is rapidly changing, and sometimes the vendor or commercial name is the really only way to identify those new modes or methods.
Correct. We don't forbid the use of trade names. Let's just be clear. We don't forbid the use of trade names. You can use trade names. We just encourage you to think about what happens when you use a trade name. And if you're presenting therapeutic options, that you are honest about giving a range of options that would be appropriate for a given circumstance. That's obviously designed to try and avoid any perception of commercial influence. If you're designing a diabetes program and you focus on one tool to solve diabetes problems, that's going to look suspicious, even if it's clinically appropriate. So you always want to talk about and debate the range of options available for a particular scenario, even if one is clearly the best. And that's just to make sure clinicians are aware that you're not promoting to them, you're giving them good advice about the best strategy in particular circumstances. So we don't preclude the use of trade names. What you read there is correct. It's a recommendation that you don't use trade names, that you use generic names. But if you feel the need to use a trade name for clarity purposes or communication purposes, that's fine.
Yeah, there are just some of those things where the trade name is what's been known for 25 years, and
Sure.
the generic name probably isn't.
Yeah, and you could say, generic name, parens, trade name, or trade name, parens, generic name if it's on a PowerPoint or something, that's fine.
We got a nudge question.
Nudge question.
A nudge question that Derek texted to me. Derek, you're not the nudge. So,
I am not the nudge. No, not
Right.
I could tell you who it is, but
I know, but
it's pretty obvious.
yeah, it's a nudge question. I didn't say it was a question about nudging.
Well,
Leave it at that. But just so you guys know, we're looking right at a monitor that has Derek looking at us. So, yeah.
I'm sorry about that, by the way.
You could have put a picture of him.
Next time.
But the question reads, and I quote,
Sure.
speaking of disincentives, because I guess you mentioned disincentives earlier, what is the ACCME's perspective on nudge science and Thaler's recent Nobel Prize? And the question it comes from Anonymous.
Yeah, well, I suppose it goes back to behaviorism. I mean, we know that many clinicians, let alone we know the public, doesn't make many decisions that are in their own best interests. And that's not sometimes just for lack of information. It's a lack of a variety of incentives and disincentives that they perceive to have short-term or long-term risk associated with them. And anytime you're thinking about behavioral modification, you have to take into account that humans are not entirely rational. And boy, do we see that in CME sometimes.
Do you want me to ask you to expand on that?
No.
I'm going to.
It's all good.
But I think the science behind this is interesting.
Yeah.
And I think, again, as we encourage providers, as they think about the education that they're developing, building in some of these educational principles that have been proven. And, you're not going to recommend one technique over another, but it sounds to me like you're recommending think about what you're doing and build in those educational strategies that really help.
I agree. I mean, be intentional about the way in which you're constructing your educational program. Any of you who consider yourselves educators will recognize that to be just true. The more intentional you are in the construction of your educational program, the more likely it is that your educational program will be high quality and deliver the transformation in behaviors or outcomes that you're looking for.
Okay. Well, we have a little in-depth question now.
Okay.
So the fun is over.
Okay.
Okay. This comes from someone named Anonymous, and it actually says it here on the paper. Anonymous.
Lovely.
What is envisioned in terms of criteria or requirements for the type of CME that would qualify for macro MIPS? How would it differ from the PI-CME model? Would it require physicians to do chart pull and abstractions? Would it be a 3-stage QI process that would take months to complete?
No, none of the latter options. I mean, certainly there are several ways of doing quality improvement. One of the mantras that I've been on is that we have done a lot of damage to our community of clinicians over the years through compliance education. The more in which we tell people you must do this is the more we create cynicism and we erode clinicians' trust and investment in their educators because they see them as levers for requirements and that are burdensome and unhelpful. So we have to get out of the way of compliance education and instead turn CME into something that's a partner for individual clinicians. And I think the first strategy to do that is to focus on relevance and what I refer to as micro QI. something that is immediately of relevance to and of interest to an individual clinician. And somewhat not seriously, and maybe though a little seriously, the example I give is if the QI initiative is that the physician wants more paper in the printer because they keep running out of paper, give them the frickin' paper. I mean, you know, if that's the QI outcome for your project, well, fine. And just identify the need, identify the outcome, make it relevant and meaningful. And it's one step on your 10-step process to improving the flow of patients in the clinic. Well, great. But don't let the expectation that you deliver national outcome metrics interfere with your willingness to do relevant quality improvement and process improvement for individual clinicians and their teams. I think we have to get out of our own way and say, no, we're partners with clinicians, we'll listen to them and help them fix problems that are relevant for the practice. And then once we have them and we have them engaged, we can start working on longer term and bigger projects. But until we get out of their way and erode the cynicism that they have about QI, we're in big trouble. So the conversations we've been having with CMS and our colleagues there have been about encouraging them to adopt the model that we proposed to them that's largely aligned with the Part 4 ABIM model, and that you can see on our webpage and it's described. And it's as simple as can be as a structure. It essentially says, are you working on something that's relevant to the clinician that's a quality improvement goal? Can you demonstrate that something was looked at and engaged with? Was there a reflection about what happened, whether good or bad in terms of an outcome? You're done. That's QI. And I know that sounds redundantly silly and maybe even too basic, but I think that's absolutely essential for us to be able to make progress in performance improvement in QI.
But I think something you said is really important. And again, I'm a provider, so I think about it. Sometimes we complicate things for ourselves, and we have to take that step back and remember some things are not as complicated as they might seem. And it's more like, if it seems to be these 4 steps, it's those 4 steps.
Yeah. I mean, just one other quick point on that is that the final rule around MIPS comes out in November, we anticipate. That'll be active for January 1, 2018, assuming it's approved, and that's an assumption. And we're in conversations with our colleagues at CMS as to link up PARs with CMS so that you can communicate completion data around the MIPS activities directly to CMS for the clinician communities you serve.
Okay, on to something a lot better.
Okay.
In my opinion, it's about communication and advocacy around CME.
Sure.
So somebody submitted a question that said, what plans are in place, if any, to increase communications on CME programs and metrics and value outside of the annual report? I know we always wait for that annual report, and it's always fun to see the changes, but they went on to say, media need to hear more news on CME. It usually only comes up in the context of controversy and commercial influence. So it really goes to, you know, sort of advocating for our community.
Yeah, I mean, it's the nature of the beast in this work and this role is that I'm on the phone with reporters quite frequently, almost certainly at least once a week. And most of the time, I'm not quoted because we're putting out fires, you know, and reporters call and say, we think this awful thing is happening, don't you agree? And it's totally fine. And in many cases, we essentially aren't the story because we've helped put out the fire. And that's, I suppose, a bit of a piece of information that the rest of you wouldn't really see. So we're out there defending the CME community and the work that accredited CME does. But we're also out there with positive stories. And there's a couple of mechanisms that we're putting in place to try and gather more of those. We do have the start of a plan in place to gather more success stories and profile them on our own website so we can share amongst each other as a community what's happening that's awesome in CME. Secondly, the use of the other criteria that the AMA is allowing to describe innovative approaches, that'll compile a whole series of interesting examples of approaches to education that don't follow the formats that I think will be an interesting compilation over a year to start seeing what's happening out there. And thirdly, we're looking at putting additional descriptors and qualifiers on educational activities so we can compile more nuanced reports about the diversity of content areas as well as types of activities that are happening out there in the community. So we are interested in the same questions. Our research committee is very interested in several of these questions, and our research committee, just so you've all heard it, are interested in opening up our data sets for research purposes so that the community has access to essentially the community's information.
Well, I think that's important because when we look at the literature, the continuing education part of the medical education, healthcare, professional education literature is kind of small.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to see somebody dig into those data and see what they can pull out of it with a positive story.
Yeah, I mean, there's intrinsic problems that are unique to education as an outcome variable in medicine that challenge our ability to do some of this work. But there's no question that UME and GME have a ton more engagement in research productivity than we do, for all sorts of legacy reasons, most specifically around resourcing of research efforts. A lot of the conversations I've had with places like the Council of Deans and others have been around engagement in the academic mission of CME, and our conversations with our colleagues at SACME have been around promoting the research infrastructure in CME units and linking them up with QI and other approaches to try and drive this process forward.
Well, hopefully we'll see more scholarship.
Agreed.
I agree in the CE world. Because you figure, we've heard this before, you know, the undergraduate time period is this little bit, and the graduate is this time period, and then CE is this time period, yet it's sort of the inverse amount of literature available.
There's lots of reasons for that.
But we can address them.
Slowly. Some of them. It's only so much the accreditor can do. Come on, guys.
Well, we're not putting on your shoulders, but you're the advocate, not the mechanism, right? Yeah. And then getting back to you have the flyer there for the ACCME 2018 annual meeting.
Mm-hmm.
You heard it here first, folks. The ink is not even dry on that.
Breaking news at CME Palooza.
It's going to be awesome.
But here's the question. So last year, the meeting sold out.
Yeah.
Right. So what are you going to do about making sure that there's education for all the people that want it? I wasn't kidding before. People were really talking after that meeting saying, this is not what I expected. It was so much more and so much better.
Well, thank you for saying that. One of the approaches I think was useful for this particular meeting was we decided very deliberately to walk the walk. And we were going to talk about novel formats in education and convening and small group work and problem-solving sessions and sharing sessions and reflection activities. We got to do it in our meetings. So our meetings are designed around that, as you saw. But it's also, we have additional capacity next year to host more people. But it's going to be more powerful the more people that are there and have stories and wisdom to share. And there'll be plenty of opportunity for that. So I hope it doesn't, well, I suppose I hope it sells out, but I kind of hope everyone who wants to come can come. But there's more information at ACCME2018.org, and you know, sign up for more information and get registered as soon as you can to not miss out.
Is that flashing up along the bottom of the screen?
2018.org.
And by the way, Graham did not ask me to say that. I think he's happy that I did, but he didn't ask me to. So now, Graham, my interviewer, let's get this.
Okay.
Well, they're not my questions. They came in. So Brian McGowan asks, what questions or criticisms give you the greatest anxiety or concern, and how do you accountably respond?
Well, I get frustrated by persistent questions about commercial influence in CME and are we just a shill of industry and that kind of thing. I get bored of that question because it's a prevalent but unsubstantiated and persisting misbelief about our system that is damaging to our integrity and our ability to do our work. So I think that gives me the greatest frustration. Of course, I continue to respond to it and respond as forcefully as I can with evidence. I think the I think that the biggest issues for us as a community is how are we going to build a system that really drives educational quality forward, and how our health system is going to start to realize that CME is their vehicle for talent management for their most precious resource. To see CME as talent management for their most precious resource. And when you have the majority of clinicians employed and health systems continue just to assume that the clinicians themselves will take care of their own education, we have problems. We have to have active engagement by health system leadership in resourcing appropriately their educational strategy and being intentional when they construct their programs and then deliver high quality education there. Gives me anxiety is a continued persistent use of models of education that we know are minimally effective. You know, a persistent use of passive approaches to education and the old types of grand rounds and other approaches that can sometimes, you know, just be a bore are just causing us more distress and are not helpful. There's sometimes good use of those, but in many cases they're not particularly helpful.
Well, I think to sort of sum it up, this has been great. That hour flew by, Greg.
It did.
What I take away from that is simplification, relevance, support. Give them the frickin' paper and the printer. That'll be quoted. And the ACC really feels like it's advocating for the provider, the clinician, and the patient. So I think this was a really great conversation. And with that, I think I hit just about every question that was texted and just about every question that was submitted that we could get to. And Derek, I'm gonna give it back to you.
All right, thank you both so much. That was great. A lot of great information. A couple questions that I got. Yes, this will be archived on our website in about 15 minutes. We'll have it on there. And second, this is my coffee mug that everyone was asking about. I got it on a CME trip actually, and yes, it's huge, but I got it because I can fit my hand through the handle, which when you have hands my size, there's not.
See, I thought you made it, and it was supposed to be round.
I should have gone with that. That would have been more impressive. Okay, so just let me wrap this up because Scott is ready to start the next session. Oh, we don't need speaker disclosure. We got a survey. If you would please, we'd love to hear your feedback and sessions you liked or didn't like or any suggestions. There's a link on right underneath the video feed that you're watching. So please take our survey. And then lastly, just a reminder for the next session coming up, which is the CME Advice Columnists coming up. Just refresh your screen and the new feed will be up shortly.
If they have any questions, Derek, that aren't answered by me,
yes,
they can Facebook us, Twitter us, email us, shout at us.
See, I have to be honest, I never thought I would hear the ACCME say that. So that is that is a,
by the way, it means them, not us.
Right. Right. I could answer. It might not be right, but I could answer. All right, great. Thank you both very much. I'm going to stop our broadcast here. I'll see everyone else on the next sessions, and that is going to be it for us today.